sure my headphone set's turned all the way up here. Yeah. Okay, speak in a normal tone of voice and we'll see how it sounds.
Okay, and how's this sound?
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Okay, and if I stay away from the microphone, I won't overpower your voice.
Okay.
We actually have two, the one on your shirt and this one will pick up some too.
I see.
All right, I'll get a chair here and we'll get the
Yep.
script. And cutting the cord. Maybe the directions on the back of the question name.
Yeah.
The directions were perfect. I
Yeah.
had trouble finding it all. Alrighty. Now, when you're ready to start, just push the red button. When the red light goes out, the tape is rolling. And we'll start with just a little background, identify yourself.
Okay.
And tell us whatever you can about how you happen to be there or
Yeah.
whatever you feel comfortable.
All right, good. All set?
Yeah.
All right, let me get this out of the way.
Asking you to identify yourself and tell us a little bit about how you came into this scene.
Okay, my name is Preston Howley, and I'm a former U.S. Navy veteran, World War II. I entered the Navy on May 26, 1943, and finished my naval service on April the 24th, 1948.
You were 18 years old.
I was 18 years old when I went in the Navy, and I was assigned to Newport, Rhode Island boot camp, where I underwent 8 weeks of training, as they pushed us through rather quick in those days. A normal 12-week course was reduced to 8. And then I was later assigned to the Office of Naval Intelligence as a radio communication specialist.
Now we talked a little bit about, we should talk a little bit about your training, and first of all, why you were selected or you volunteered for this training.
I volunteered.
You volunteered and you had a little background in it.
I had background in it. I excelled at typing in school, and then I was fortunate. My father was a president of the Tropical Radio Telegraph Company, and I went into Boston, his radio stations, and for 6 months prior to my enlistment in the Navy, I practiced under one of his radio operators who taught me the basis of TWX and radio teletype.
So you were a natural and the Navy was glad to get you. I'm
Yes,
sure.
that's about the size of it. Yeah.
So you went to school in Washington?
Yes, I went to school in Washington. It was an 8 weeks course in the most up-to-date teletype radio communications that we had at that time, which was a perforated tape, and which would transmit at 60 words per minute back to our base station in Washington, D.C. of all information that we received from our radio operators in regard to the interception of German submarine or Japanese submarine messages.
So we talked a moment ago about the unit. You were assigned to a unit that was...
I was assigned to Op 20G.
Op 20G was more like a naval district in that it was a giant area of responsibility, a unit that covered a great area.
Yes, right. And due to the sensitive nature of the material from top secret right down, we were not really told much about the other operations in this complete scenario. In respects to the cryptograph room, people working in cryptograph, which actually ultimately broke into the English language exactly what the enemy was saying. And this was the function of a station. Now, I was assigned to Chatham Naval Radio Station on late September of '43. And after arriving, we had 3 watches covering the day shift, evening shift, and midnight shift. Round-the-clock coverage of the German U-boat transmissions.
Now, the area of responsibility ranged from as far north in the United States as Maine.
It went all the way from Newfoundland, and right down to Recife, Brazil.
So different units covered different areas.
That's correct.
But Ops 21, your unit, covered exactly what area?
Well, it depended on the radio freak man. In other words, our frequency operator would set up all the frequencies. Now, we would have a total of usually about 20 operators, 20 radio operators listening on different frequencies. So you had 20 different frequencies at least being covered. they could, as far as the area that they were operating in, I really couldn't speculate on that. I don't know. I would have just assumed that they would be assigned a sector to cover, but I'm not really sure on that.
Basically, if you could receive a signal, you received a signal.
That's correct.
So even if it was in Brazil, if you somehow could pick it up, you
That's
would
correct.
Yeah, I see.
And whatever was received by the radio operator was handed to us, and we, through our teletype machines, would forward it to Naval Intelligence in Washington, D.C. for further process in the field of cryptograph.
I've dropped my script somewhere. I'm sitting on it. Okay. Okay. So the one group is responsible for deciding what the Germans were going to be transmitting. You set up the transmission, the reception apparatus, and then it was your job to copy the.
That's right. To retransmit. Yeah.
And you passed it on to another man who could turn it into the English language.
That's correct. Through at the receiving end in Washington, this is where that was done.
Now, were these messages, assuming they started one way and maybe stayed that way and weren't changed, how were these messages coded? They weren't just simply in the German language.
German code is a four-letter, during World War II, was a four-letter code. And the designators of how important the message was, to give you an example, if the preceding two letters, WW, would be a weather bulletin. If it was a BB or a B bar, it was Enigma. This was the code machine that the German operators aboard the submarines had to set up their code, who were not aware that we, through the capture of a German submarine by the British in the early part of the war, were not aware that we knew exactly what they were saying. And through this process, we never let on, right to the end of the war. It was the most closely guarded secret in World War II that we had the German code and could understand everything they were transmitting.
Now, it was a little out of your area of responsibility, but since the British actually had the single Enigma machine, do you suppose the Americans were able to copy it, or we basically knew how it ran and we were able to duplicate its mechanism?
We had our own code machine. I wouldn't be a bit surprised that through research of some sort was instrumental in the design of our own code machine, which, by the way, they never knew.
They never broke it.
We never broke our code, because anything we transmitted back would be in code. And then we had what they call a scrambler at the other end, which would unscramble the transmission. The size of the group at Chatham, we had 2 officers, about 7, 8 chief petty officers, approximately 100 men, because we ran 3 watches, as I mentioned before, about 24-hour coverage of these frequencies. The traffic was extremely heavy when I was there, and it was all that 3 teletype men could do to keep up with it. And we were able to transmit at 60 words per minute because of these advanced machines.
Oh boy.
And we also had at the station 10 general service personnel. These would be cooks, bakers, motormechs, to run our auxiliary power, things like of that nature. They were not in our operation. We were strictly, our station had civilian guards, and as we get along in this tape here, which were after this incident, security was reinforced at the station.
So you were at first billeted right there on the station in the barracks?
I was billeted at the radio station itself. The majority of the enlisted men were billeted in the Hawthorne Inn in Chatham, which was a private inn taken over by the Navy during the war. It no longer is there. There is now a Hawthorne Motel. It burnt down right directly after the war. The main station had 2 main houses of brick, and the officer and chief warrant were berthed in those homes. I was berthed in the main brick building, which was a 2-story in front of the radio shack, which was in back. Our transportation to and from the watches and to the mess deck, which was at the Hawthorne Inn, was by a Navy bus. We were approximately 3 miles from the billet quarters of the majority of the men stationed there.
Well, then so we've established pretty much how the station was oriented. You wanted to ask if there were any Army intelligence or G2, OSS, any other personnel that you might have seen.
There was a Coast Guard radio station and a Coast Guard light station in Chatham, which were up the road about 4 or 5 miles. There was an Army radar station directly in back of us, approximately 2.5 miles to 3 miles away from us on a high hill overlooking the ocean. The waves that came to relieve us in the end finally took over the Rose Acres resort for the billet quarters, and they had one wave officer in charge of that group. This was to relieve us for overseas duty and take up the operation that we were presently performing. As far as Secret Service and OSS, I can tell you this one thing. I know we were constantly being watched by the FBI. That much I do know. We were told to keep very, very quiet on our operation, not to mention it to anybody. We had a lot of inquisitive people in Chatham wondering what we were doing there, a Navy station.
Loose lips sink ships.
Loose lips sink ships, that's correct. And because of that, we were constantly had the feeling that we were being monitored in all phases. And of course, in those days, you didn't ask any questions. You just did your duty, and that was it. There was you kept away from any talk with civilians, especially civilians, on our duties.
Now, one thing that I wanted to ask, as you started working there and you were copying transmissions, what kind of message traffic or radio transmissions did you copy from our own forces that might be sent out against the Germans, or?
That I really don't know. We didn't have any function in that. Our only function, again, like I say, was the copying and the retransmission of these signals back to Washington Naval Intelligence.
Okay, so you were there in fall of '43. Do you remember anything? Does anything come to your mind that relating to combat actions in the immediate area? The end of '43?
Not really. I was aware that a German submarine was sunk at the entrance of Buzzards Bay. I've been told by several people that it was possibly a mine layer. It was on the eastern entrance of the canal.
What time frame would this have been?
Around 42, I would say 42 or 43 it was sunk, as I understand it now. I don't know how accurate my information is. A lot of this is scuttlebutt. But that's what I had heard. And
so there was a feeling that you were really doing something important.
Oh, yes.
You knew that these subs were all around, and
we did a very good job there. In the end of the war, we were the personnel that served there and also overseas in the Pacific, where I also served, were awarded the Navy Unit Commendation for our work. So I'm sure our work was very, very essential and very helpful in the culmination of the naval war.
There was a good camaraderie and
oh yes, very much so. Very much so.
Tight unit. Okay, so as we, if there weren't any outstanding incidents in through '43 that you're reminded of, the first one we're particularly interested from an airship standpoint would have been in July of '44 off Bar Harbor, Maine. A fisherman had spotted a U-boat periscope and reported it, and a blimp was detached. The K-14 was detached to investigate. Now, do you have any recollection of any message transmission around the early part of July of '44 that would have indicated there was a U-boat in the area of Bar Harbor, Maine?
Again, a lot of this is scuttlebutt. I had heard that they had sunk a German submarine off Bar Harbor.
And indeed it was sunk 2 days, about 48 hours after the K-14.
As far as where I heard it, I'm not sure on that one. This is 52 years ago.
Yeah.
And
but you don't remember any particular message traffic that would indicate that?
Not on that one, no, I don't, no.
Okay.
Pertaining to this one we're going to come to, yes, I'm well aware of what I'm pretty sure that went on there. But as far as the one off Maine, I'm not really sure, but I have a good suspicion that reports I heard and the blimp involved leaves a lot to be desired as far as an explanation from our government.
The Court of Inquiry held the pilot responsible as pilot error as flying too low and impacting the water, but there were a lot of unanswered questions like why all the bombs were launched and why the machine gun had been fired so much.
That's right.
And why there were so many holes in the envelope.
That's right.
And we're trying to track that down now, but we do know that the U-233 was sunk a few miles away about 48 hours later by surface units.
That's correct.
And supposedly one of the survivors, of which there were 30, bragged about having shot down the Zeppelin.
Right.
And you know there's no German word for blimp.
That is correct, yeah.
So they would have either said Zeppelin or perhaps Parzival, as we know from
Right.
their advertising blimps back.
Right.
So any other thing that comes to mind before we get to our point where we are in the latter part of it? We're now in the late summer, early fall of '44. Nothing eventful happened that comes to your mind, but that takes us up to this point. At best, as you can recall, he asks here, what year and date did you and your team first encounter the German U-boat WT transmission off Cape Cod?
Okay, the reason I remember this, why this thing is fairly clear, I had gone on watch, on the second watch, and this was in August, and the reason I remember the month was that Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands and her two daughters, when it fled Holland after the Nazi invasion, were summering with Secret Service protection in Chatham Bar's quarters across from the Chatham Bar's Inn, which was just down from the Hawthorne Inn. I've seen the Queen many times going by in the bus, and we've waved and she waved back, and other than that we never had any connection with her. But she would stay there until the closing of the inn, which was usually just after Labor Day. And so knowing that she was there at that time, I know that this was the month of August. At the time of this incident, we sat back to back to the radio operators with a wall that separated us, but with a cut through. In other words, so the chief could hand the messages and put them into the receiving box, where our watch chief would pass them to us, to each individual that's on the machines, and this is how we kept feeding the material to Washington. Now, at the time of this incident, we could hear all the talk and conversations in the radio room. It was designed that way. There was no door leading into our room from the radio room, and of course this cut through, this big large cut through. Well, at the time of this incident, I heard this one radio operator start laughing, and then she said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Well," he said, "you won't believe this, but he said, I got an S5 signal here that's so strong, it's unbelievable. But the thing is that up the street from us, approximately 3.5 miles, is a Coast Guard radio station. Now somehow this German transmission, this submarine, had got onto the Coast Guard frequency. Now whether it was intentional or non-intentional, we don't know. But one thing we do know was that the Coast Guard radio operator broke in on the German's transmission. Now the German submariner never heard him and wouldn't have any reason to be hearing him, and berated him, forbidding him the use of radio transmission in a war-restricted area, and to cease all transmissions immediately.
Do you suppose this operator knew it was a German submarine?
No, he did not.
So
he
was
had
just
no
trying to
idea.
get somebody to get off the air.
That's right. He's telling him to get off the air. Now, it's this message that's the one that's in question.
Now the man who heard this thought this was a big joke. It was very funny.
It was really funny. I mean, they all started laughing. I could hear them laughing, and he's telling them to get out there, that he's in violation of the Communication Wartime Security Act.
And the men who were laughing knew it was a German submarine.
Of course, because they were covering it. So as this message progressed, it came in 3 parts. I do remember that. the total time of transmission probably was around 12 minutes. Originally, once when I was asked by one of the editors to the Preston Howley, I think it was, and had called me in relation to this, he had put down a 20-25 minute period. The 20-25 period minute was not the actual transmission. It was the time it took with the brakes. There was 2 brakes in it. Now, I got the first section of that message off. Then the transmission ceased for a minute or so. And then, in continuation of the same message, it continued on. And then again, another pause and break, involving probably 5 minutes even. But again, the same sub, transmitting, until finally the message had been completed. Now, this particular message was a B-bar enigma, high priority. To whom it was going to, I do not remember after 52 years. I remember how we used to type them. I know the call signals of the German receipt back in Germany, which I believe were ADA, and I can't tell you for sure that who it was directed at. The reason for this, being accurate on this is because there's a possibility, as I've been told, that the White House had a special receiver, Enigma-type receiver advanced. And there's a possibility that this submarine was possibly trying to defect. And the U.S. government knew about it. And of course, I heard no more about it that day, but however, the next day, when I went on watch, I heard one chief, we were relieving the watch, say to the oncoming chief, "We got one of the bastards." And the only one that could have possibly heard it were the groups right close to me, and also the few radio men that were on the other side of the wall. There was a dress down in the office the day after.
Now, before we get to that, you didn't have any idea then how the
No.
German had been intercepted? And
No, I
destroyed?
did not. I just assumed that the DF, we know DFs are working the whole coast. And whether it's the HUPTUP or the higher frequency direction finders that nailed him, I don't know.
So these were advanced direction finding equipment was in place, and they could pretty much tell where a transmission was coming from.
That's correct.
And fairly quickly.
Very quickly. With HUPTUP, they could tell instantly. Longitude and latitude, no problem.
So it's conceivable that the transmissions, once they were isolated and located to a certain point, as a combat unit was assigned to attack that transmission
That's
location.
correct. We had TVS squadrons in Hyannis for that very purpose, at Weymouth, and of course we had the blimps. Now I've seen the blimp many, many times, both daytime and even coming on to dusk, making its rounds, whatever its sector of coverage was.
And it turns out the blimp pilots had said that they used one of your radio towers as a navigation
That's
checker.
correct. This Joe Bell that has claimed the sinking of this submarine, Joe told me that he's used our antenna pole many, many times as a navigational check on his route from Weymouth.
So the blimps are around. You knew they were as well as the
around.
TVFs.
Yep.
Okay, so after the chief, kind of like feeling like we had success and said we finally got one of the bastards. What was the feeling around that time? People were busy, of course.
Very busy, and I question just how many people actually knew about that remark that the chief made. I heard it. The other 2 men in the room that were may have heard it, I don't know. There was never too much talk about it, with the exception that what made everything sort of spooky was that the next day, the office in that radio shack, the skipper was in there and he was chewing this chief out. And it was pretty much keep your mouth shut. What the hell are you doing here? What are you saying here? This is off limits. I don't want to hear this talk. And that was about the size of it.
Now, had you put together 2 and 2 there that the...
Not really. I did. It really didn't sink in. I mean, years later it did, but...
as far as the guy who was first laughing and saying, oh, there's a German
That's right,
out
I
there, and they're
didn't
trying
get
to tell him to get off the air.
Right.
And then next day we knew that we detected and
That's
destroyed
right.
that German.
That's right.
And then the third day he was received a dressing down for loose lips.
Right.
We never really put all that together that at that time.
No, I'm going to tell you something. One day, myself and 2 other men that were communication specialists, we had a break. In other words, we used to work 3 days, day watches, 3 evening watches, and 3 midnight watches. And then we were given 72 hours off. On one of these occasions, 2 of my friends, we had a little small skiff. We rowed out from the cove that we were adjacent to, out to Chatham bars for the picnic lunch and all that. We went swimming over there off the bar, and there was a wreck over there. In fact, I got pictures inside, I'll show you, taken on the beach there. And it did come up. We were looking out at the Atlantic, and I remember one of the men said to me, did you hear that incident there in the old man's office there about we got one of them? I said, yeah, I heard it, but I said, I don't know anything about it. Nobody said anything to me about it. But it was definitely, I think, a cover-up.
So the signal was so strong, the boat had to be very close.
The boat was extremely close. This guy, this radio operator was, I remember him well. He was a nice fellow. He was first class. And he said it was like being on top of him. He said that signal was so strong. And the thing that I've always wondered about, as the years have gone by, is what was he doing on the Coast Guard frequency? Was he trying to get around us, knowing that probably we were there? Or was it just a fading off his regular channel that he was assigned to operate on, his frequency?
Perhaps a bizarre atmospheric condition
Right.
where the frequency was so strong at that distance that it also came
Right.
bled over onto the...
Was he trying to get under the Loran? There was something going on there that I think that they knew what they were doing. In other words, he wasn't by airing off his frequency. I think it was trying to get by our interception.
Now, do we have any idea what he actually said in this transmission?
No, there's no way of knowing that because, again, like I say, this was all 4-letter code. And the only people that could tell you that would be the cryptograph people that worked on the message.
They actually had the Enigma.
Right, and as I told you earlier, that we were not informed, we weren't allowed in those rooms when we took our training. The less you knew, the less you could talk about if anything befell you and you fell into enemy hands. So we were kept in the dark about the other end of the operation. We knew what cryptograph was, we understand what it is.
Now, he wants to be specific about whether we had any knowledge of whether the sub was passing or was...
Well, it was definitely on the surface, there's no question about that. I mean, it was surface.
They couldn't transmit radio underwater.
No, not to any...
not at depth.
Any depth. And of course, in the area that she sunk in, which I've been told is around 40 feet, and even going back over the years with the shifting of the shoals there, top depth would probably be about 60 feet, which makes me wonder what he was doing in that close.
Crazy, because
now
you could
there's
see
Monomoy Island there. Monomoy Island is a place you could land saboteurs. Now they had landed saboteurs on Long Island during the war. Those saboteurs were all caught because of the vigilance of a Coast Guard patrol with a dog and their inability to execute him after they stumbled upon him when they were landing from the rubber life rafts.
a U-boat put him ashore.
That's correct. And they were saboteurs, and they got loose, and there was they were quickly rounded up, and one of them turned state's evidence, or what do you call it, plea bargained for his life, because he helped and locate the other ones that were spread all over different cities with all kinds of incendiaries and papers, which this actually happened, was in the Time magazine back then, and the others were executed, and this one man was allowed to return at the end of the war. He was the only one out of that whole group.
Now, there were several saboteurs up and down the coast in different locations then.
Yes.
Probably launched by U-boats at different points.
That's correct.
Well, getting back to our mystery transmission, He asked, do you recall any feelings of frustrations by you or your crew as the lack of response from forces or commands regarding the tardiness in intercepting?
Not really. We were so busy there that we really didn't have time for that. I mean, when I say we were busy, I mean we were really busy. You don't realize if you only knew how many U-boat messages were going out, it would stagger the imagination. You just would not believe that kind of traffic could exist.
All up and down the coast and
Correct.
any number of places. Now, he asked, about how long was it the time you picked up the first U-boat transmissions when you first recovered that, when the first vessel had been destroyed, and how was this information received? The chief had made that comment.
Yep.
What was the feeling among your crew at the time they heard of the U-boat sink? Do you remember anybody else saying, like the beach incident when you went out?
Not really that I knew of. Again, I was, like I said, I was quartered at the radio station, so I didn't get in contact with a lot of the other fellows up there at the Hawthorne Inn, as you would if you had more leisure time with them, with the exception of the incident I mentioned on the beach.
He says, were there any unusual observations the following day when you reported for the next duty assignments?
We did have tighter security. Security was beefed up.
More civilian guards or military?
There was an additional guard at least put on it, and they had in front of the station there was like a half-moon turn. The bus would drive in, past the guard, and come out the other side. In other words, just like a half moon. And then, as I recall, a second guard post was put down by the other end of the moon.
Okay, he asked if there was any talk. We've covered that. Now, being busy and lots of other message traffic coming through, that was about the last you'd heard of it, and there wasn't any further discussion of it?
No, none whatsoever.
Okay. So then we move on to the point where they were beginning to replace the men with waves.
Right.
To take over these duty stations so you could be deployed overseas.
That's correct.
So what about the time? When were you transferred out of Chatham?
I was transferred January of '45, and in that time I was given a 7-day leave, and my orders read to report to Oakland, California, for further transfer to Guam in the Marianas. Went across country on a train and arrived at the Naval Barracks at Oakland, and took my shots and so forth overseas, and abandoning ship, jumping in off a 50-foot platform, all this. And my orders were handed to me, and I was told to proceed to the USS Chandler, which was a 4-stack destroyer, World War I.
Oh.
I boarded that ship, and after it got underway, my orders were opened, and through a Navy snafu, I was on the wrong ship. Instead of going to Hawaii, which was my first leg of my journey to Guam, it was going to Long Beach. So we went to Long Beach and finally anchored there, and I was finally put ashore at the Roosevelt Barracks there, and I finally boarded the USS Oklahosa, which was a Navy oiler carrying high-octane gasoline for my final journey to Pearl. While I was aboard the Chandler, I heard scuttlebutt again. We get a lot of scuttlebutt in the Navy. The Jap sub was sunk at the entrance to Long Beach.
Fairly close in.
Very close.
Do we have any idea exactly when?
Well, again, I don't. Again, this is all what I can recall of the conversation of several crew members. Now, when they said we sunk it, whether they meant the United States or whether they meant their vessel, I am not aware. But I do recall, because working in the interception of submarine messages, it was of interest to me. It's just something that stuck in my mind, but I do recall. The only other time I've ever heard anything about that was while I was doing my scuba diving back in 1956. There was a publication called Divers Down, and in it listed this incident of a sunken Japanese submarine at the entrance to Long Beach, and a federal law going out prohibiting scuba divers for diving on it because it was very unstable. the ammunition, torpedoes, whatever, aboard it, and they were warning divers it was out of bounds to dive on it. Now, at the time, this Earl Leggett and Warren Leggett is how I passed the information on that finally got to Ed Michaud. When I talked to them back in '56, I had mentioned that a German sub was sunk off Cape Cod and close. And when Earl Leggett and Warren asked me about its location, I said, I can't tell you, but I can tell you one thing, according to our radio operator, it was real close. So, years went by, nothing more was ever thought of it, and I think Ed called me around 1992, I guess it was, or 93, and out of the clear blue sky asked me that he had talked to Earl and Warren, and they had located this German U-boat laying on the bottom in 40 feet of water. And that's how I got involved.
Now, since then you've talked to Joe Fallon.
Yep.
He was the command pilot of K-25. Of
Yep.
course, K-25, like other K ships, was a Zeppelin-style command. There was a command pilot, there was a pilot, a rudderman, a
Yep.
helmsman,
Yep.
and various men assigned to radio, weapons, what have you. And they would have carrying 4 depth bombs. And we feel pretty sure now that they were dispatched. In other words, they were already in the air, probably on a routine patrol.
Yes.
And when this message came in, one way or another, they were assigned.
They were directed right to it, right?
So, did he tell you anything else in the phone that...
Well, he told me that when they came in on him, they had opened up with anti-aircraft gun at him. And they made the bad mistake of making a crash dive. And he remembers seeing the men scrambling to get down the conning tower, and she went down, and as we mentioned before, the depth of the water was extremely shallow, which means at the best he could just barely cover his conning tower, even at 60 feet, and that he had come over him and dropped one of his depth charges and hit it directly in the back of the conning tower. And that he saw debris come up and floats them. And that's what he told me on my telephone conversation with him. And returned to base. And
Surely there must have been great rejoicing. We finally got one.
No, that's unfortunately when his testimony to me was over the phone. He said when he got back to his base, his commanding officer came out and chewed him out. And said, now you've stirred up a bee's nest. You better keep your mouth shut and forget all about this incident when he went to report it. The next day, he went back to his blimp to retrieve his photographic equipment that showed the action, and the tapes had been taken from the camera and removed when he feels by Naval Intelligence. And he was transferred to the Canal Zone, just like that.
We understand that the whole crew was broken up and sent to different places.
I wouldn't doubt that. I can't speak of the crew, but I do know in his conversation with me, he told me he was transferred to the, and that...
he wound up in Brazil eventually.
Right, in Brazil, and he was apparently stumbled onto something that he wasn't supposed to stumble onto. That's what I'm getting the point of. In other words, the left hand didn't tell the right hand what was going on.
He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do.
Right. If this indeed was a defecting submarine, regardless of what connection it had with the White House as far as its ability to transmit directly to the President or the Secretary of State via this special machine that was evidently smuggled out of Germany to the White House, we don't know. But I can tell you this one thing. He was a scapegoat. I feel sorry for Joe. I figured Joe, like his son told me, my dad has been telling me how he sunk a submarine in the war, and even his own crew of comrades all denying the report, saying he's loco or something like that. And well, I think that's mean. And I'll tell you something else. I think there was a real stinking cover-up here by the U.S. Navy.
There must have been some terrible threat made against the man.
I'm sure. In fact, he told me he felt that he had to be very careful when he got down to the Canal Zone because there was even possibility that somebody was trying to take him out.
Oh, my Lord. Now, he did ask here about the Dutch royal family, if there was any connection that you were aware of with the Dutch royal family being there at Cape Cod.
Well, originally when I mentioned this to Ed Michaud, This Chatham, where I was, is almost like the background of a good movie, of intrigue, foreign agents, if you would. Here was the Royal Dutch family, and of course, with Secret Service protection, and here we didn't know who was in town and who wasn't in town. Everybody had to keep their mouth shut. It had a real background of a great spy novel. We had no contact with them other than we would wave to them when we went by, and I've seen the Queen many times wave back at us. And she had her two daughters, Beatrice and Juliana, and their group that was with them.
Also on the outskirts of this whole story, he says, had you heard any details about the temporary German capture of the Coast Guard lighthouse at Round Hill Point?
Again, I heard scuttlebutt on it, but I can't pinpoint it. I really don't know anything about that. I have heard it, but boy, 52 years, you're lucky to remember. The only reason I remember this one is because of the incident with the Coast Guard operator. And that is something you just don't forget. I mean, that kind of thing sticks in your mind.
Now, we know that blimps were redeployed in the Northeast Corridor late in the war because of a fear of various midget submarines. Now, but you were already in the Pacific by then.
Yes, I went at the time that I told them when I rode the Chandler down to Long Beach. It was a very nervous crew. Obviously, the Japanese submarines were still a threat. And in fact, when I ended up on the Oklahoma to go to Pearl, carrying high-octane gasoline, I'm going to tell you, I'm glad to see the 5 days go by real quick and get off at Pearl. When I got off at Pearl, they had to do something with me until they could facilitate my transportation there, so I was assigned to the Navy radio station at Waiawa at Pearl, just up in Pearl.
Well,
up in the Schofield Barracks there.
Well, I think of it, while you were there at Long Beach, you probably saw blimps operating out of the
Yes,
Naval
I did.
Station. Did anybody ever question why we didn't have blimps out in Hawaii?
Again, it's one of those things you just don't think of, you know.
We've heard that there was an animosity there. Rosendahl was not liked by the guy who was in charge of Pacific, and
That
he
could
refused
well
to
be.
have the blimps.
That could well be. But I know that on my final leg of my journey, they told me to live out of my sea bag when I was assigned to that Iowa station. And one night about 2 o'clock in the morning, they woke me up and put me in a Jeep and took me down to Hickam Field. I got on a C-47, loaded with freight. And the first stop we made was this Johnston Island for refueling. And then on to Eniwetok and Kwajalein, and then finally Guam. When I got to Guam, I worked on Jap code, and of course, which was 5-letter. And our DF station was right on the base where our radio station was. And my enlistment, the war had ended then, finally, and everybody was going home. But I was USN. I joined the regular Navy. I wasn't going anywhere. So I watched all my comrades going back on points and so forth, and then a young friend of mine that I went through school with joined the Navy, and he got assigned to the battleship Wisconsin.
Before we get to that point, we know that the Germans were operating in the Indian Ocean, and late in the war they were trying to make some deals with the Japanese, and a German submarine surrendered to U.S. forces. It was trying to reach Tokyo with radioactive materials and a disassembled Me-262 jet fighter.
That's right.
When you were copying code, do you remember hearing anything about...
Oh yes, I am. They were called the Monsoon Fleet. The Monsoon Fleet were the larger German-type boats, and there was quite a few of them. And that operated between Japan and Germany, sometimes bringing material. And we had, even out in Guam, we picked up those signals even before I got there. I know there's record of German U-boat receptions on the Guam station before I was actually stationed on Guam.
But in spite of your experience with copying the German code, they didn't ask you to do any particular German stuff. You were still assigned to Japanese training.
No, I went strictly on Japanese. As I started saying, at the very end, I shipped over for what they call a 2-year hitch. Everybody's going out of the Navy so fast, there were ships sitting there with no crews to sail them back. And I asked for the battleship Wisconsin because my buddy wrote, he says, you ought to get aboard this. He was a radio striker. And he says, we're going on a midshipman cruise to Europe. And this was in 1946. So when I went and made my request for re-enlistment and transfer to that ship, I was told that I didn't stand much of a chance, but they would submit it. And they did, and it was approved. So the minute it was known in the intelligence community that I was going to leave, I was not allowed in the Radio Shack anymore in Guam, which was then starting to copy Russian code.
Oh.
And I was given a detail of 5 Jap prisoners every day to take out and work around the direction finder poles, keeping the growth cut down and so forth.
When you're in transit, they give you some of the lousiest jobs.
So
you picked up the Wisconsin.
yeah, I got on the Wisconsin. We made the first. We were the first. We went with our sister ship to New Jersey, picked up the midshipman in Annapolis, and we sailed over up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and then over to Rosyth, Scotland. We spent the 4th of July in Oslo, Norway, and then we came down to Portsmouth, England. We had Liberty in all those ports, and then we crossed the Atlantic, went through the canal and down into Chile, and back up to Peru, back through the canal to Venezuela, and over to Gitmo and back to Norfolk. That was the end of our cruise. It was a long cruise.
What a terrific time.
Yep, that was the good part of the Navy.
Well, help me out here now. If there's anything else that comes to mind that is related to any of this, how we're trying to, from my standpoint anyway, we're trying to establish that the airships were a vital part of the total anti-submarine warfare picture. And anything that comes to mind that, from your experiences, where they played a part. Have we left out anything?
I don't think so. Only thing is I agree with Joe Fallon, and I agree with Ed. I think there's been a very, very serious cover-up of an incident that happened off Cape Cod. I personally believe that everything that I've been informed on in regards to this by Ed is really starting to fit together. And I feel sorry for Joe Fallon because I know his son has been instrumental in trying to get the recognition that his father deserves.
We think it's safe to assume then that the K-14's loss really wasn't related to this. In other words, somebody didn't get confused that this might have been the defecting submarine.
I don't think so, because I'll tell you why. The 233 that you mentioned was not this class boat. This boat here, it was only one built. There was 3 of them designed, and we're not even sure of the U number on it. There's three particular numbers. It's one of the 3, but we just don't know which one it is.
But its radio call letter is what we go by, and that was WT or LT?
No, that would be the wireless transmission.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, Ed has done a lot of research on this. This boat here apparently was built for the Aberfuhrer. Now, the Aberfuhrer was a very select group in Germany. Now, if the story is correct, this was a U-boat that was trying to defect. And aboard it, there's a question of some very high-ranking people. Possibly could have been on that boat, from church leaders to politicians to industrialists, that type of thing. The thought in my mind crosses that possibly trying to end the war between Germany and the United States earlier than and outside the Nazi realm of control. Again, this is all speculation. But because I think Joe Fallon stumbled on this through direction of the signal that we picked up, and also the DF that pinpointed this boat was not supposed to be sunk. And It's
Nobody
also
told the blimp crews.
nobody told the blimp
Said,
crew.
go get him, and they did.
Right, and so finally, to bear this out, when Joe returned to the Weymouth Naval Hangar, the blimp hangar, here's his skipper chewing him out. Now you've done it. Now you've stirred up a bee's nest. You pulled a bugby, you know, and what are you going to say?
Oh, what could you do? Boy, how frustrating. Okay, well, if I think we've covered everything in Ed's list, and we've certainly covered everything I could think of. And if you're satisfied that we've covered
I really think we have covered it very, very well. I'll tell you, I was very proud to have served with the men and women in the ONI station. They all deserve credit for the work they did, the long hours that they put in, and the great information that was passed on to the right sources for further action to shorten the life and save lives as many of our merchant seamen as we could from the sinking of these U-boats and causing their final end. I know that in fact, a neighbor of mine right over here, that was over here, he's from Canada, and he was a U-boat survivor. And he was captured in Norway, Trondheim, and Henry and I have become good friends over the years. We've talked about U-boats, so forth, and he showed me his pictures of the sub that he was on. He was one of the lucky ones because there was 40,000 that went to sea, and 30,000 never came back, and he was one of that 30,000. And it was no picnic for those guys either, you know. But unfortunately, we're not worrying about, that was a time, kill or be killed, whatever, you know. You got to remember that.
Well, okay. Well, we greatly appreciate you talking to us. And
Okay,
we'll wind this up here.
I hope I was any help at all to you.
I'm certainly.
I hope Joe Fallon gets the recognition that he deserves, because I'll tell you, there's a man that deserves it, as far as I'm concerned.
You can push the little button there.
All righty.